We turn now to Hebrews and chapter 10. The first 18 verses of this chapter are a continuation of the theme that began in chapter 9, verse 1, of the better worship that is offered us under the new covenant. And here we read, "For the law, since it has only a shadow of the good things to come and not the very form of things, can never by the same sacrifices year by year, which they offer continually, make perfect those who draw near." Now there again is the same emphasis. The law could not make people perfect. And the contrast is that under grace, people can be made perfect. Perfect in what sense? It's already been mentioned in chapter 9, verse 9, perfect in conscience. The New Testament speaks of two types of perfection. One is an absolute, sinless perfection, which will take place only when Jesus returns in glory. Paul says in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 12, Philippians 3 and verse 12, he says, "I have not yet become perfect." And he said that towards the end of his life. What did he mean? That he was not yet sinlessly perfect. He could not say that he was completely free from sin, because there were whole areas in his unconscious being which he was ignorant of, which he could only discover as he faithfully walked with God, like the lower part of an iceberg. In our subconscious being, there is sin that we are ignorant of. That's true of all of us. It was true of Paul towards the end of his life. It was true of the mature apostle John, who at the end of his life says, "If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves." No, there is sin in our subconscious being. But what Paul could say was, in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 4, "I'm conscious of nothing against myself." And that's what the mature apostle John could also say. In 1 John 2:1, "These things I write to you, that you do not sin," that is, consciously. And chapter 3, verse 8, "He who commits sin is of the devil." There is a difference between having sin, 1 John 1:8, which refers to our subconscious being, and committing sin, which is a conscious act. So we can be perfect only in that part of our being which we are conscious of. Perfect in our conscience. And this is what Paul says in the same breath in Philippians 3:12, where he says he is not perfect. In verse 15 he says he is perfect. So in the same paragraph he says two opposite things. I'm not perfect and I am perfect. Meaning, of course, that he was not sinlessly perfect, because there were whole areas of his being that he was unconscious of. And only when Jesus came could he be completely free from the presence of sin. But he could say that he was perfect according to the perfection offered under the new covenant, which is perfect in conscience, perfectly free from conscious sin. And Hebrews 10:1 says the same thing, that the law could not make those who come to it perfect. Otherwise, it says in verse 2, if they were perfect, then those offerings would cease to be offered, because the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have had consciousness of sin. He's speaking again about conscious sin. But in those sacrifices, he says, there is a reminder of sins year by year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Therefore, when Jesus comes into the world, he says, "Sacrifice and offering thou hast not desired, but a body thou hast prepared for me. In whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast taken no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the roll of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God." And after saying above, sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast not desired, nor hast thou taken pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law, then he said, Behold, I have come to do thy will. He takes away the first in order to establish the second. By this will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But he, having offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time onward until his enemies be made a footstool for his feet. For by one offering he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified. And the book of Hebrews is showing how the new covenant is better than the old covenant, and here it is, that under the new covenant we can be perfect in our conscience, and we can be sanctified, verse 10, by the same will that Jesus had. Now looking at this passage, verses 5 to 9, these are words quoted from Psalm 40, verses 6 to 8. Sacrifice and offering thou hast not desired. That is, what God actually desired was not just the offering of bulls and goats. These were only symbolic and typical. But now a body hast thou prepared me. Jesus was given a body in the womb of the Virgin Mary. A body was prepared into which Jesus came. And he took a body of flesh like ours and came into this world. And he said, that which God desired above burnt offerings and sacrifices, behold, I have come to do thy will, O God. What was the sacrifice that Jesus offered? He offered up his body as a perpetual sacrifice to God. We read in verse 6, in whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hast taken no pleasure. That's not what God was looking for, but a body in which his will would be done. That's the meaning of verse 5 and verse 7. A body hast thou prepared me, and in this body I have come, says the Lord Jesus, to do thy will, O God. In that body which God gave him, a body of flesh like ours, he completely did the Father's will. No human being had ever done that before. In every area, in every point, in thought, word, deed, attitude, and motive, Jesus did the will of God. Lo, I have come to do thy will, O God. And his own human will he offered up as a perpetual sacrifice to God. He said, not my will, but thine be done. Many times Jesus said these words, I have come from heaven, not to do my will, but the will of him who sent me. Turn for a moment to John's Gospel and chapter 5. John chapter 5 and verse 30. In the last part of that verse he says, I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And in John chapter 6 and verse 38 he says, I have come from heaven not to do my own will. What did he do with his own will? He denied it. Or in other words, he offered it up as a sacrifice to his Father. He said no to his own will, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he said, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. That was his own human will. But he denied it. He said, nevertheless, not my will, but thine. There was that human will which Jesus denied perpetually. He offered up his human will as a sacrifice to God continuously in that body which God had prepared for him. And thereby he pleased God utterly. He came to do God's will, and he took away, Hebrews 10 verse 9, the first covenant in order to establish the second. How did he take it away? By doing the will of God completely in every area of his life. And it says, by this will, verse 10, we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. We are brought into a fellowship with Jesus Christ in this area. And Jesus has given us an example by his own life of obedience. He says to us, follow me. Our will is to be laid down as a perpetual sacrifice in these bodies of ours, if we are to enter fully into this new covenant that Jesus has come to establish.